Hey guys, welcome to the Remnant Radio. You're watching one of 19 episodes with Dr. Craig Keener, one of the preeminent Bible scholars on the planet, and we're talking about the Gospel of Mark.
This is going to be an exciting episode. The connections that Dr. Keener put together while we were with him at Asbury Seminary, phenomenal. But man, it was an expensive trip to get all of us out there to film this content. But we want to give it to you for free.
Well, we do want to give it to you for free, but one of the ways that you can help offset the cost for this is by purchasing our home group material. Dawson, our researcher, has put together this material. There's a leader's guide. There is a participant's guide. So you watch the video, you read the material, and then we walk you through. We have discussion questions that go along with it. Could be a huge blessing for you and your church.
Yeah, and this would be perfect for tons of different mediums. Maybe you're a pastor who's preaching through the Gospel of Mark, a home group leader, a Sunday school teacher. This would fit all of your needs. If you want to pick this up, there's a link in the description for the home group material. In addition to that, maybe you're out there and you don't lead any kind of group like that. Maybe you just want to contribute as a thank you to what we've put together here on Remnant. There's PayPal descriptions in the link of this video if you would like to support us.
So absolutely, click those links in the description, hit that subscribe button, and please enjoy this video with Dr. Craig Keener.
Jesus has been having conflicts with various groups of the elite in the temple, and now having not been accepted by the temple leadership, he's about to talk about the future of the temple, and it's and future crisis in general. I mean, there's a crisis coming immediately in the short term with the temple of his own body, in that the passion narrative immediately follows, and it's also significant in the sense that right before the passion narrative, Jesus is warning the disciples of what they're going to need to face. And he's already said you need to take up your cross and follow me. He's going to get a little bit more specific here. But this is the future from the standpoint of Jesus speaking to the disciples. So is it future from Mark's standpoint? I think Mark is writing before the destruction of the temple, so I think it's still future from Mark's standpoint. But having said that, I also think because it's before the destruction of the temple, Mark doesn't know yet whether Jesus is going to come back immediately after the destruction of the temple or it's just a prerequisite. So I think we have these things blended together more than, say, we'll have maybe in Matthew or Luke, which I think probably were written after the destruction of the temple, though I'm open to changing my mind. But that's my current, where I'm at.
Okay, so this is the end times chapter. This is what people characterize as the end times chapter. Aligns with all of a discourse of Matthew 24 and then Luke chapter 21, and then we have Mark 13. Mm-hmm. And it begins, we just came out of a widow who does a great thing at the temple. She gives up her last 2 mites and follows Jesus. And then...
A mighty deed.
There you go. You have the dad jokes down, I'm telling you. So then... We're now outside the temple, and the disciples seem to not understand any of the context of temple things that Jesus has been saying about the temple. Oh, look, and so now here they are. Oh, look at the beautiful temple. It's so wonderful. Not one stone will be left upon another. Mm-hmm. And I know that you're big Bible background guys, so I'm just curious. How big are these stones? What is the temple? How significant of a statement is it for Jesus to make here?
Stone cold significant statement. I'm trying. That was a stretch. I was reaching.
He should be stoned for that. Actually, you sound like you're stoned. Anyway.
No.
Yeah. Anyway, so but you can understand they're not from the big city, and here they are in the big city, and when I moved from Philadelphia to Wilmore, I had culture shock for a couple of years. There was from the big city to the
mm-hmm.
small town. We have 2 stoplights here, but these things would be massive by anybody's standards. I mean, the Temple of Artemis of Ephesus, you read about in Acts 19, that was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the way the Greeks enumerated them. But Herod's temple was bigger, way bigger than the Temple of Artemis.
Wow.
It was the biggest temple in the ancient Mediterranean world. And Herod made sure of that. He was a master, talk about building projects and talk about an edifice complex. He wanted to be known for this monument that would survive forever which a lot of Jews thought that it would. A lot of Judeans thought that it would. Some of the stones in this temple are more massive than the stones in the pyramid. So, or in the pyramids. So, if I'd been prepared, if I'd known you were going to ask that question, I would have probably looked up exactly how many tons they were. I think that some of them are like 2.5 tons, but I don't have that one in my memory. But these are massive. You have pictures of them where here's a person and here's the big stone all around them. So these because we still have the foundation stones, some of those huge. When Jesus says not one stone will be left on another, that was like inconceivable. I mean, this is a fortress of itself, and it functioned as a fortress during the war with Rome. The Temple Mount was considered impregnable by many Jewish people. I think it may be in the letter of Aristeas, but there are places in Jewish literature where they speak of it as impregnable, invulnerable. There were a few Jewish sources. You have it like in Testament of Solomon. Testament of Moses, probably from the 1st century, talks about the temple being destroyed. You had in the Habakkuk Pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were people who were, thought that at least the corrupt priesthood would be judged. But for the most part, I mean, most people thought, wow, this is magnificent. This is the symbol of God, and it will never be destroyed. Herod's temple was, there's not one stone left upon another, though, echoes in the Old Testament the idea that there would be a stone upon another as the second temple was being rebuilt. So this is the unbuilding of the second temple. And people are going to twist what Jesus says. Somehow somebody heard about this besides these 4 key disciples, but in a twisted way. Maybe it was on the way up to Mount Olivet where he's talking to these 4 disciples that somebody overheard him, but is saying that, Jesus is saying, I'll destroy this temple and build another one. And some people were expecting the Messiah to rebuild the temple. Some people actually were expecting a new temple, which may presuppose the uprooting of the old one. But Jesus really did come to build a new temple as the cornerstone of a new temple. And this new temple we read about elsewhere in the New Testament is built of Jewish and Gentile believers together, people from all ethnicities, as God's people, something more magnificent than stones, people made in God's image.
Amen.
And it's a magnificent claim to see something that is so, I don't want to say outlandish, but like something as great as the temple, no stone on top of it, and the disciples, I think, ask a reasonable question: when will this happen? And what will be the sign for this to be accomplished? You want to speak to that?
Yeah. Jesus' answer about the sign is basically, you wait for a sign, it'll be too late. But when will this be? He says, you're going to see a bunch of things. These aren't the sign yet. But then you're going to, when you see the abomination of desolation, that'll let you know you need to flee from there. But then he's going to go on to talk about I believe there's two things here, because, we're after the destruction of the temple. We can look back and say, okay, Jesus didn't come back right then. So I believe he's addressing 2 things. And Jesus may not have even known that there were 2 things, because a lot of times the prophecies in the Bible, they blend together events according to the kind of event, but they don't have dates attached to them. And so the idea is some things will be fulfilled within a generation. The temple will be destroyed. That's within a generation. But of the day or the hour of Jesus' coming, of that, no one knows. Jesus says, I don't know that.
Okay, now I understand, because we were just, what you just quoted was verse 4, Josh. What will be the signs? It seemed like it was twofold. When will these things be, and what will be the sign that they're about to be accomplished? The sign, you said, the abomination of desolation, which we're going to get to momentarily. Now understand, so Matthew Matthew asks or poses this question, it seems like, in a little bit different way. Can you address that?
Yeah, I think Matthew's writing after 70. And Matthew asks a twofold question. When will these things be? He's just said not one stone will be left on another. So that's, when will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So, that separates it into two things. Mark isn't as clear on that, which is one reason I think he's writing before 70. I mean, he doesn't owe it to us to have to be clear. We know he's not always clear on everything, but, he may not have done.
So Matthew might have been wanting to help us see a clear delineation, because by the time Matthew's writing, hey, the temple's destroyed, Jesus hasn't come back yet, and Mark seems to think that it's possible that the coming of Jesus and the destruction of the temple are real close.
Still was possible,
right?
If he's writing before 70. But if you're writing after 70, it's not. And paraphrase was legitimate, and Matthew has every right to clarify. Again, ancient biographies did that, and
this was the norm.
Things got reworded, yeah.
Okay, so we have this next section, Matthew. We're in the Gospel of Mark, 13, 5 through 13. It talks about specific signs. What are these signs supposed to precede?
Good question. Because there were a lot of prophecy teachers in the ancient world, a lot of Jewish apocalyptic writers who would give various signs of the end. And these signs could include things like earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, famines, pestilence, and also some other things Jesus doesn't mention, like mutant babies and, all sorts of
zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, the kind of things you can see on the, what are those things in the newspaper stands? Not the
tabloids.
The tabloids.
Tabloids.
Yeah. Thanks. So space aliens kidnap Noah and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So Jesus says, okay, you're going to see all these things. Oh, yeah. That's what we're
expecting.
Famines,
earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars.
Yeah. He says, these are just the beginning of birth pangs. The end is not yet. Now, Matthew, I think, does it a little bit differently. This is the beginning of birth pangs. The end is not yet. But then there's one thing he says, this must happen before the end. And that's the good news being preached among all the nations. In Mark 13:10, that's kind of in the rest of the list. But certainly verses 7 and 8, Mark is pretty clear. These things will be ongoing before the end comes. Some people think that all these things were fulfilled in the first century. Certainly all these things were ongoing in the first century. Earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, famines. Some of them are mentioned in the New Testament elsewhere that they happened, and we have archaeological and literary evidence for all these things. But as for the gospel being preached among all the nations, whether that was completely fulfilled in the first century, I'm kind of skeptical of that. But those who say that it was, they'll cite passages in Colossians and in Romans where Paul says, okay, now I've preached the gospel to the whole world, and he means representatively. And there's a point in that we can't exactly quantify what God means by the gospel being preached in all the world. We just know if the Lord hasn't come back yet, well, my opinion is, if the Lord hasn't come back yet, our job isn't done yet. Let's keep at it. And we really want to see the Lord come back? Well, let's keep at it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned the beginning of labor pains. He seems to group together these initial, these not signs, but these, whatever we want to call these
non-signs.
things, these non-signs. Okay, so these are the beginning of labor pains. You described them as happening, yes, in the first century, but throughout history until the return of the Lord. So where does Jesus get this language from, and what does it mean, beginning of birth pains?
Jewish people, well, actually, the Old Testament already spoke sometimes of times of great suffering as like birth pangs. But Jewish people also often spoke of the final tribulation as a period of birth pangs. Yeah, it's going to be suffering, but it's going to bring forth the new world, and therefore it's worth enduring this. But Jesus says these aren't the final things. These are just the beginning. Now, we've been in an eschatological time, an end time, so to speak, for a long time. And since Jesus rose from the dead, the New Testament calls that the first fruits, his resurrection, the first fruits of of the final resurrection. It speaks of the last days. Peter says in Acts 2:17 already, in the last days, says God, I'll pour out my Spirit, and Peter's applying it to what's happening there. 1 Timothy 4, 2 Timothy 3, 2 Peter 3, it's a lot of time. And Paul speaks of birth pangs currently as something the world is undergoing. So we are in an eschatological time, but it's just the beginning of birth pangs. It's there's certain things you're going to have to see before certain other things.
Okay, so a bit of a loaded question here. So navigate around this how you would, but is it possible that these signs were fulfilled in the first century? Is that historically plausible to think that these signs or some of these signs could have or did in fact happen in the first century?
Many of my colleagues think so.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that with the gospel being preached to all the nations. I think maybe there's one reason Matthew breaks that out separately.
Yeah.
That he sees that as a continuing mission. But yeah, many of the others were happening in the first century. They didn't stop in the first century, but they were happening then for sure.
Okay, so let's talk abomination of desolation. Everything you can tell us about that you think is relevant for us, but I'm interested in its source in Daniel. I'm interested in the fact that Jesus' contemporaries thought this was a thing that happened in the past with Antiochus Epiphanes IV. At least that's my understanding. You look like your face disagrees with that. But then Jesus applies it to the future. So tell me where I'm wrong, and just help us understand abomination of desolation and how it's used.
The not one stone left on another in 13:2 announces the destruction of the temple. But what would precede the destruction of the temple? What would precede the desolation? Now, Matthew actually kind of tells you before this, because Jesus is talking about, your house is left you desolate. So you kind of know what he's talking about, with that house when he gets to the abomination of desolation. Of can mean a lot of different things in Greek, or what we say, the way we translate of, it's the Greek genitive. And it may mean the abomination or the desecration that leads to desolation, that leads to the destruction of the temple. So it's something that's going to let you know that's coming. And yeah, it did happen, like in 165 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes. It wasn't the only time in history it happened. The Babylonians destroyed the temple. Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple. The temple was destroyed in the year 70. The site was desecrated with the Temple of Venus in 135. And, we might mention others as well, but just to say, people did look back on that. Daniel 11, in context, does seem to speak of 165. But then Daniel 12, it's like it seems to precede the end. And Daniel chapter 9, also it seems to precede something about the anointed prince and
being cut off.
And I won't get into all that because that's a debate, and I'll leave that to Daniel scholars, I guess. But, you've got 3 different passages in Daniel that refer to this, or something like this, use this language. But when Israel sinned, its temple would get desecrated or judged or so on. Well, it's happening again. And so Jesus can apply that to his day. I don't know that he was the only one to reapply the language. That's why I wrinkled my face. But I wasn't saying you were wrong. I just have to think about that. But he's expecting it to happen again. Now, there are different opinions of exactly how this was fulfilled. Within a generation, certainly the temple was destroyed. Jesus is speaking somewhere around the year 30. The temple was destroyed in the year 70. That's a 40-year generation. Some scholars think that it's when the temple was destroyed. Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, tells us that the Roman soldiers erected their standards in the site of the temple, which Jerusalemites considered a desecration even to have the standards within the city, because they functioned as idols. They bore the insignia of the emperor, worshipped as a god. They were ready to go to war lest Gaius Caligula's statue be put up in the temple in the 40s. You know, the abomination of desolation, it really looked like it was about ready to happen then. Maybe Christian prayers gave Jerusalem a little bit longer. But in the year 70, they sacrificed to the divine emperor on the site of the temple. But about 3.5 years before that, there was another desecration that helped lead to that desolation. And you had some of the revolutionaries going into the temple. And because the priests who served there, especially the aristocratic priests, were associated with the ruling power, they went ahead and slaughtered priests in the temple. You know, what Jesus elsewhere talks about the blood of Zechariah, you know, shed in the holy place. Well, they shed the blood of the priests in the temple, and they actually took a man who was, what would we say? There's a better word for this, but he was learning disabled, whatever, and he didn't know what was going on. But they crowned him as high priest, set him as high priest. He wasn't even a Levite. The real high priest said, "Oh, these abominations, would that I'd never lived to see this," and before he was slain. So the temple was definitely desecrated. And when you see this, now in Luke, it's just when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem, but when you see the abomination of desolation, I think maybe a majority of scholars think in 1314, this was fulfilled around the year 66, 3.5 years before the destruction of the temple. But again, there are different opinions on that. Eusebius tells us from an earlier source that Christian prophets at this time were telling the church in Jerusalem, now's the time that was spoken of. You know, so they had a little bit of extra incentive and they fled. Jesus says, when you see this, let those who are in Jerusalem flee into the mountains. Now, so this is something that's Jerusalem and Judea specific. This is not global at this point. It's Jerusalem and Judea specific. Flee into the mountains. Jerusalem was in the hill country. It wouldn't be hard to get into the mountains. But normally, when war is coming, refugees flee into the city, the protection of the city walls. So Jerusalem was packed with people instead of people fleeing to the mountains. But the mountains...
Except the Christians.
Except the Christians.
In fact, didn't no Christians that we know of died in the massacre of the 1.1 million Jews?
We don't know. Well, Josephus may have
fudged the numbers a little bit.
He may not know. Yeah, I doubt that they went around and counted all the corpses. But anyway, but yeah, the narrow mountain paths, you couldn't fit a whole army there. I mean, you couldn't appeal to your numbers. You could fit like just, you know, a handful of people at a time. So people up above could be throwing down rocks. That's what the Zealots did at Masada, or the Sicarii did at Masada, which didn't fall until the year 73. So fleeing into the mountains, in this case, was going to be safer. And Jesus also gives them other expressions of haste, maybe with some element of hyperbole in them, but emphasizing the value of life over possessions, just like he did with the man over the swine and so on. He says, if you're working in the field and, you know, it's getting warm, so you go out with your outer cloak, but it's getting warm, you leave your cloak at the edge of the field. You know the abomination of desolation has happened. You leave your cloak at the edge of the field and flee. Well, you're going to be cold that night. You're not going to have anything to sleep in that night because the outer cloak was used as a blanket for most people. It's the one thing a creditor couldn't take from a debtor overnight. But Jesus says, leave it. And later, you know, in chapter 14, you have people leaving their cloaks behind to get away from Jesus. They're fleeing from him instead of fleeing from the temple, the temple's destruction. But if you're on the roof, and we talked about this in chapter 2 about the roof being used for all sorts of things. Don't go into the house to get anything, because remember, you come down through an outside staircase, not an inside one. So you just don't take time to go into the house. That may be hyperbole, but when my wife was a war refugee in Congo, where she's from, they didn't have much time to decide what to take and what not to take. You know, a lot of war refugees, they don't even take their passports. Well, you can't get out of the country legally and be settled in another country legally without a passport. So, but, you know, it's urgent. Life matters more than anything else. So run.
Better be cold and alive.
Yeah. And he says, pray that your flight not be in winter. So the only reason I can see that Mark would include that in there is that it hasn't happened yet. So Mark is still expecting it. But pray that your flight not be in winter. Well, in winter, in the Judean hill country, you could have such cold that you actually get snow sometimes. But also, you would have the wadis, the dry creek beds, they could be filled with water. The Jordan could overflow. Even in the spring, when the war actually broke out, there were a bunch of refugees. They were actually trying to get to Jerusalem, but they got to the Jordan from the other side. They couldn't get across because it was night. They were afraid some of the children would die, and they'd be drowned because the Jordan was overflowing. So they waited until morning. In the morning light, the Roman army caught them and slaughtered them all. So Jesus is very serious about haste, and it may be hyperbolic, but you know, at the beginning, people could still flee from Jerusalem. Even when the Roman armies surrounded, you know, the revolutionaries wouldn't let anybody out. But, you know, some people climbed over the walls or got out some other way and did manage to escape to the Romans and say, we're surrendering. But after a while, by I think the year 67 or 68, word got around among the Syrian auxiliaries on the front lines of the army. Word got around that some of the Jerusalemite fugitives had swallowed their jewels and so on, so that later on with the Bible movement they could take them out. And at that point it was too late to escape, because if you managed to get past the revolutionaries guarding the gates, you get caught by the Syrian auxiliaries. They would hold you down, take out a knife or sword, cut you open to see if you had any jewels inside. So it's a horrible thing. And when Jesus talks about you better get out of there, it's going to be a terrible time. And you know, his heart goes out to the mothers who are nursing or pregnant or whatever. It just was. Josephus says mothers ate their children during the famine there. So it's just, which Deuteronomy 28 also talks about. But it's just horrible.
This is probably a brief question because I think I heard you allude to it earlier. Verse 30 of this chapter speaks of this generation. We'll see these. I'll quote it verbatim. Truly, truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Now, I heard you say within one generation, within 30 years, the temple was destroyed. 40 years, the temple was destroyed. So, did I hear you correctly in saying that you believe that maybe that verse was fulfilled?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because that's how the phrase "this generation" is normally used by Jesus. Yeah. It's used that way in Mark. You know, you faithless generation, Mark chapter 9. It's used in Matthew in the same context, even that way. You know, all this judgment will come on this generation, and it did within that generation. So that's not a surprise. Now, one theory has recently been offered that generation. Sometimes when Jewish people spoke of the last generation, it was, you know, when this evil was released in the world until the end. So if we're speaking about being in the last days, as it speaks of elsewhere in the New Testament, or 1 John 2:18, you've heard that an Antichrist is coming. Even now there are many Antichrists. It is a last hour already. So in the generic sense, maybe it's a generation from then until now.
Like a perpetual generation.
Until the Lord comes back. But if we take it in a more narrow sense, it actually did happen within 40 years. That part of the chapter.
Okay. Theological question. Is there any space, maybe not, maybe textual, is there any space for a pre-tribulation rapture in this passage?
It actually, yes, when it says to flee from Jerusalem, these are people getting raptured in the year 66. And if you missed it, you're sunk.
So really. The rapture already happened as well.
You missed it. Sorry. And it happened
What are we all
again
here
in the
for?
year 2000 with Y2K. And no, I'm just joking. We did an episode on that before, and Michael Brown and I did a book on that. Obviously, there are different views on that, but I think most scholars, including I think most pre-trib scholars, I may be wrong, I can't speak for them, but I don't think most of them see a rapture in this passage, because the only gathering of God's people you have in, I think, 26 and especially 27 most explicitly, is at the end of all this, when Jesus comes back, and it's very visible. And,
It's not a secret before a great tribulation by the 7-year
but
deal.
you all know my views.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So no one, Jesus' famous quote, no one knows time or hour, right? When does this speak to Jesus' lack of omniscience? How are we to understand that text?
Well, no one knows the day nor the hour. We can say that probably doesn't have to do with the destruction of the temple, because, as the days are progressing, the temple is, the Roman soldiers are getting closer and closer, and finally it's being burned, and people are being burned alive, and so on. So he's not talking about that. He's talking about his coming afterwards. So the temple was destroyed, and his coming is afterwards. It doesn't say how much time is in between, but anyway, yeah, it does speak to his omniscience, and it clearly shows Jesus was not omniscient in the flesh, and we saw that back in chapter 5 as well. Mm-hmm. So people who have a problem with that need to remember Jesus. Okay, we confess Jesus is fully human. He's fully divine, but we also confess he's fully human.
He hungered and he thirsted and he tired.
Exactly.
Things God doesn't do.
He came in the flesh. Yeah. And to deal with the Gospels, you have to deal with both sides of it. Yeah. And that's, basic Christian confession. Some later scribes tried to mess with that, but Matthew leaves it there. It doesn't have a problem with it, because it's understood that's something the Father hasn't revealed to him. And does he know it now? Could well. But he didn't know it then.
It's a deeply theological question. We cover it in great detail on other episodes. So people who are interested can go check some stuff out.
Okay, so last question, and this is how the narrative ends. Jesus exhorting the disciples to stay awake. What is the significance to that? Could you please stay awake, Dr. Keener? So what is the significance of that in the context of Mark's overall narrative? Like, what's he trying to communicate with this story?
It's just like, his calls to perseverance elsewhere. In Mark chapter 4, you have a lot of exhortations to hear. Mark chapter 13, which is kind of the you have the early discourse and you have the later discourse. Mark 13, you have a lot of exhortations to watch. Watch out for false prophets with signs and wonders. That's not me. When I come, I'm going to gather.
Lightning east to west.
Yeah, well, that's Matthew.
Is that Matthew?
And Luke,
Okay.
But that's fine. That's Jesus. But in Mark 13:33 to 37, Jesus is saying, okay, you don't know the day nor the hour. Jesus didn't know. So how anybody who goes around saying that they know now is saying that they know more than Jesus. Although Jesus is pretty exalted in that. Not the angels, not even the Son. So he's clearly higher than the angels. But he says, watch, be ready. And he gives parables, or a parable about that. And yet, in the very next chapter, in another time of crisis, before the climax of Jesus' first coming, his own disciples, his chief disciples, 3 of the 4 who were with him on that mountain when he gave that warning, go to sleep on him when he needs them most.
I hope you've enjoyed that episode on the Gospel of Mark with Dr. Craig Keener. If you want to go back and watch former episodes that we've done, there's a playlist right here, or you can watch the very next chapter, which will be listed right here. If you've been blessed by this episode or other episodes we've done, consider giving. There are links in the description.